In today's video, we'll be looking at the Great War, also known as World War I. The beginning of the 20th century saw the nations of Europe greatly increase the size and the strength of their armies, while negotiating secret alliances in the event of war. All that was needed was a small spark to ignite the powder keg of tension and lead the major nations of Europe into the worst war the world had ever seen. Now, a war like the Great War doesn't just happen overnight. It's the product of long-term causes. One of those long-term causes, what we sometimes refer to as the main causes, is imperialism. Now, imperialism is the glorification of military strength that caused the major nations of Europe to increase the size and the strength of their armies, until you have these massively large armies that are over 1 million men. They become these giant military hammers. And if you have this large military hammer, then every problem seems like a nail. And so this becomes one of the major issues in causing World War I. The second long-term cause is the system of alliances. These alliances led to the rapid cessation of the war in July and August of 1914, as two alliances in Europe drug indirect nations into war. Now, the third long-term cause is imperialism. The desire to acquire power over territories led to tension between nations who sought to weaken their competitors by taking their territory for their own use. And so this sense of competition between the nations pits them against each other to a point where they become very, very competitive, where they're always trying to outdo one another. Now, one of the last main reasons, or these long-term causes of the Great War, is nationalism. Now, nationalism was that movement of ethnic and national pride, like the ones that had unified Italy and Germany, were now sweeping through many areas, including the Balkans. And it's in the Balkans where World War I begins. On June 28, 1914, Serbian terrorists attempt to assassinate the Austrian heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that you see pictured there. One of the assassins, a guy named Gavril Princip, is successful by shooting the Archduke and his wife in an open car while they were touring the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo. Now, a month later, on July 28, 1914, Austria declares war on Serbia. And why it took so long for them to declare war is because, for one, Serbia didn't do this. It was a group of Serbian terrorists that weren't really affiliated with the Serbian government. But still, Austria wants somebody to pay for this, and so they're prepared to go to war if Serbia doesn't handle this. But the problem is, if Austria goes to war with Serbia, that might bring in war with Russia. And Austria's kind of scared about this. And so during that month, they're negotiating with Germany and saying, hey, we're thinking about going to war with Serbia. If Russia gets involved, do you support us? Will you help us fight off the Russians? And so Germany has to evaluate the situation, thinking, if we aid Austria against the Russians, Russia has a new alliance with France, and we'll have to worry about the French on our backside while worrying about the Russians on our front. We have to prepare for this. So in that month's time, there's a lot going on behind the scenes to either hopefully prepare for war and in some cases avoid a war. But on July 28, 1914, Austria declares war on Serbia because it has Germany's support that if Russia gets involved, Germany will aid them. Well, soon after Austria declares war on Serbia, Austria is bombing Serbia. In response to Austria's bombing of Serbia, Russia begins to mobilize, which means to prepare their army in the event of war on the Austrian-German border. This is seen as an act of war by the Germans, and I'll explain why in a minute. But on August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia, and also declares war on France, because Russia is allied with France, who also begins to mobilize on the German border. So France is now involved, and in a very quick maneuver, Germany invades France through Belgium, a neutral country, whose neutrality was protected by Britain. So when Germany invades France through Belgium, a neutral country protected by Britain, that brings the British in on the war, who declare war on Germany. So you can see from the chart there all the alliances and how they're kind of played out. The Ottoman Empire will eventually join Germany and Austria to form the Central Powers against Russia, France, and Britain, who form the Allies. And you see here all the major powers and their imperial colonies get involved in this war that starts as a regional conflict between Austria and Serbia. When that one spark, the assassination of the Austrian heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is killed, that is the spark that ignites the Great War, this World War. Now the question becomes, how did we get to this point? How did this regional conflict between Austria and Serbia break out into this world war between the major powers of Europe and eventually the world? Well, it all has to do with timing. And what I mean by that is, what if it takes your army longer to get to the front lines than your opponent? You come into the war at a disadvantage. Germany is already coming into this war at a disadvantage. It's stuck between a rock and a hard place. That rock is France, and that hard place is Russia. As you can see from the map, it's stuck between two opponents, Russia and France. But the Germans had a plan for this, on how to take on these two powers, come out on top, and eventually win the war. It was known as the Schlieffen Plan, in which the German military would smash into France like a sledgehammer through Belgium, defeat France quickly by taking Paris, and then be able to redeploy most of their forces to the east to defeat Russia. But again, all this hinges on timing. Many believe, and the Germans had this as part of their plan, that it would take the Russians nearly 950 hours to mobilize their troops and get ready to go to the front lines. That's roughly about 2 weeks. Germany's plan involves taking 2 weeks to very quickly take out the French. And you don't have to take them out entirely. Just subdue their main force enough that you could mop up the rest. Then move your forces to the east and be able to take on the Russians head on. Well, the problem comes in Germany invading France quickly, because Germany could invade France here on the German-French border, but to do so would take months for the Germans to push through that very heavily defended area and push up against the French army and defeat them. It would have taken time, something that Germany did not have a lot of, because while they're dealing with the French on one side, on the west, in the east, that 950-hour timer is ticking, so they've got to move quickly. The Germans realize and plan that the only way for them to take out the French quickly is to surprise them from the north by going through Belgium, remember, a neutral country, and Germany just kind of hoped that Belgium would just step aside and let them march their armies through, having nothing against Belgium, just needing to use their country to pass through. But that doesn't go over very well with the Belgians. They're very upset and actually fight back against the Germans, which is like a house cat fighting a lion, but it takes the Germans longer to get into France than they had expected. And once they got to France, not only are they having to deal with the French army, but because they violated Belgian neutrality, the British sent troops, and now they're having to worry about the French and the British. And so by the time the Russians mobilize, which happened to be earlier than the Germans had expected, Germany has not subdued France, and now they have to split their armies and fight a two-fronted war, the thing they did not want to do at all, because they had not planned for Belgium putting up a resistance, and they really had hoped Great Britain would not get involved, but they do. They get involved in September of 1914 at the Battle of the Marne. Here Germany advances on Paris, but is halted. What this creates is a stalemate on the Western Front. And again, during the war we refer to the front lines as the front. And so there's a Western Front over here between the Germans and the combined British and French forces, and there will be an Eastern Front over here between the Germans and the Russians over here. But what I mean by stalemate is that no one can win. All armies involved are strong enough to hold out and not be taken over easily, and because no army can overtake the other army on the battlefield, they have to literally dig in. This introduces a new type of warfare known as trench warfare. Warfare that's fought from dugout trenches in which the two armies would dig trenches that were anywhere between 100 yards to a couple of miles apart and spend the rest of the war climbing out of those trenches, crossing the land that separated them, known as no man's land, and attacking each other. And you can see from this diagram here what trench warfare looked like. On the front lines you have your thousands of soldiers stationed here waiting for the enemy to attack. Behind that point was a support trench, which may have had a concrete bunker or machine gun nest there to shoot at anybody coming across no man's land to attack your troops. Behind that point was a reserve trench to store supplies and medicine, as well as reserve troops. Behind them are long-range artillery, your cannons, your mortars, that will shoot over your troops at any advancing army that's coming across no man's land. If the potholes, barbed wire, bombs, and let's not forget the front line with these thousands of troops stationed here pointing a gun at any army crazy enough to cross. As the invading army, you have to overcome all these obstacles to win over your enemy's trenches. And for both sides, this is nearly impossible. That's why if you look at these numerous battles of World War I, you see these massive casualties, millions of troops that die fighting this war. Case in point, from February to December of 1916, we have the Battle of Verdun, which is the longest and bloodiest battle of the war, in which 700,000 soldiers die. That's incredible. The world had never seen a war like this. The nations of Europe were not prepared for a war like this. And when you see casualties that high, and neither side back down, you start to understand that this war becomes a war of attrition, a war based on wearing down the enemy through heavy attacks and losses. And the reason this war took so many lives, the reason why neither side in this war was prepared for the carnage that was unleashed during this war, has to do with the new warfare technology. Many of these armies that went to war during World War I hadn't been in a major conflict with a major power since the armies got together and fought Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s. So it's been almost 100 years since war has broken out between the major powers of Europe, and a lot has changed technologically since then. And the European powers are not prepared for that. They're fighting a 20th century war with 19th century tactics. They're trying to fight a 19th century war in the 20th century with 20th century technology, and it just doesn't work that way. For example, you didn't have machine guns during the time of Napoleon, but they exist in the 20th century during World War I. The machine gun was an automatic weapon, allowing hundreds of bullets a minute to be shot. It's one of the reasons for the high casualty rate of this war. During Napoleon's time, you're lucky to get off 4 shots in a minute. Here you can shed 100 bullets in less than a minute. One person with a machine gun can take on an entire battalion. 300 guys. One guy against hundreds. Incredible. This had never been seen in warfare before. European powers were not prepared for that. Another thing, tanks are introduced during this war. Essentially an armored vehicle that they put together to try to cross no man's land and overcome the trenches. Basically, get across no man's land without getting shot. And then you have things like airplanes. The war breaks out in 1914. just over a decade since the introduction of airplanes, and they're already being used in warfare for their ability to do reconnaissance or spying and attacking enemy positions. Then you have probably one of the most gruesome weapons introduced during World War I, which is poison gas. This deadly gas is used to burn or suffocate victims, mustard gas being the most popular, which would actually burn the victim's skin and lungs, or chlorine gas, which would suffocate the victims. And how this was done is they basically shot over canisters like a smoke grenade full of gas that would land in the trenches and explode, releasing this deadly gas. At the same time, from your enemy, he's releasing gas from these nozzles that would blow over no man's land into your trench, hoping that your army is unprepared without a gas mask and will suffocate and die as they come across in masks and attack you. Again, a horrific weapon. The fifth thing that you see there are U-boats, which are basically submarines. The term U-boat we usually associate with German submarines, but these began to be used widespread during the war because of their ability to sneak attack both military and supply ships or cargo ships, which will be one of the main reasons why the United States eventually gets involved in the war. The last two things that you see there are radio and zeppelins. Radio provided wireless communication. The ability to communicate with your troops and commanders on the battlefield wirelessly was a great advancement during World War I. And finally, the zeppelins there are simply large airships similar to blimps, but they're constructed differently and usually contain hydrogen in them rather than helium of today's blimps. So they were much more flammable, but were used just like airplanes for reconnaissance and bombing. But as this war drags on after the first year, this war of attrition seems ineffective, and both sides begin to look for allies to unbalance the stalemate that's taking place in their favor. And that's where America gets involved. America's longtime friend Britain started a naval blockade of Germany, attempting to prevent supplies and other contraband or prohibited materials like guns and ammunition from reaching Germany. And at the same time, Germany realized that the Allies relied on supplies from their overseas colonies and other nations like America. And so Germany launches its own naval blockade of Britain in unrestricted submarine attacks on any ship thought to be carrying weapons to Britain. But in 1915, the Lusitania, which was a British passenger ship that looks like the Titanic, was sunk by a German U-boat, killing 1,200 passengers, including 128 Americans. This would be the first of many ships that were sunk, killing innocent Americans, and each time the U.S. President at that time, Woodrow Wilson, condemns these attacks, but stops short of going to war. The United States at this point is somewhat anti-war. They feel this is Europe's problem, and the U.S. has spent the past 100 years staying out of European affairs, and therefore they don't want to get involved. But then in 1917, there's the Zimmerman Note. Fearing American involvement might unbalance the war in the Allies' favor, the Germans send a telegraph to Mexico that asks Mexico to join the Central Powers against the United States if the United States entered the war, promising American land in return. And therefore, the Zimmerman Note, on top of more American ships being sunk, forces the United States to, as President Woodrow Wilson is quoted to say, quote, to make the world safe for democracy, and, quote, end the war to end all wars. So in 1917, the United States goes to war. At the same time, in 1917, the Russian Empire experiences a workers' revolution and government change that pulls Russia out of the war. With no threat on its eastern front, the Germans turn their attention to the long stalemate on their western front, launching a massive offensive in a final effort to win the war, which they almost win. But then the British Russian reinforcements, along with nearly 2 million American troops, referred to as the Yanks, who had just arrived in time to hold off the German advance, and therefore the Allies began to win. And so in the summer of 1918, the Allies, with America's military resources of soldiers and war materials, had finally tipped the balance of the war and began a counterattack that forced the Germans back. By November 11, 1918, with the war going so bad, the Central Powers finally seek an armistice, which is a ceasefire, that goes into effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, ending the fighting of the war. And so at this point, the war is over, and many other nations that had been involved during this Great War will celebrate the veterans of that war, which would become known as Armistice Day. But over time, in many countries, the idea of celebrating other soldiers from other wars pushed November 11th to become Veterans Day in many countries like the U.S. Now back to the end of the war. The war ends in 1918 with what's known as the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ends World War I, with the nations of the United States, Britain, France, and Italy all meeting to discuss the terms of the treaty that Germany will be forced to agree to. And while the United States thought that Germany should be forgiven and let's just move on, Britain and France did not feel the same way. And again, you have to remember, they had been in the war for a lot longer and had suffered a lot more casualties than the United States. The United States just got involved militarily in the last year of the war. And yes, they helped win the war, but were not in the war for very long. And so for Britain and France concerning this treaty, Germany will be made to suffer. And the best way to think about the effects of the Treaty of Versailles is to think of the view of Britain and France towards Germany. They look at Germany as a brat. And if you look at that as an acronym, it really breaks down what the Treaty of Versailles does. For one, Germany will be blamed for the war, known as the War Guilt Clause, because during this entire war, the biggest question of all is, who's at fault for this? Who's to blame for what started this war? Well, Germany and their allies will have to take on full responsibility for causing this war. And because they could be held responsible for starting the war, they also will be held responsible for paying damages for this war. That leads us to our next part, reparations, which are simply payment for war damages. These would have to be paid out by Germany to the nations of Britain and France, which oddly enough took them to the early 21st century to finally pay off. The third thing that you see there is that their army is harshly restricted. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, the German armed forces were restricted to no more than 100,000 troops. The manufacturing of weapons or importing and exporting of weapons was prohibited. Poison gas was prohibited. Tanks were prohibited. Their naval forces were limited to 12 destroyers, 6 battleships, and 6 cruisers. They were not allowed to have any submarines anymore. And military aircraft of any kind was prohibited. So again, their army was harshly restricted. And finally, German territory in Africa and the Pacific was lost, and the borders of Eastern Europe were redrawn, forming new countries, as you can see from the map there. Every country in blue is a new country that was formed out of World War I. The purple country you see is Austria and Hungary, that were split into 2 separate countries, and the size of those countries was greatly restricted. And those that are in pink are countries that were already established but had a change in territory or size. And lastly, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, a League of Nations was formed to prevent future wars. The idea that there should be an organization where all the nations of the world could come together and jointly work out their differences and avoid having to go to war to solve their problems. In the end, World War I would lead to another world conflict, as the effects of this world war proved to have dire consequences that impact and influence the rest of the 20th and 21st century, justifying its initial title as the Great War.